Welcome everyone to this week's LinkedIn Live. My wonderful guest today is Brennan Jacoby, and we've been connected for a couple of years now at this stage, and always have really interesting and insightful discussions. So absolutely delighted to have Brennan on the most recent podcast episode, which came out on Friday. And if you haven't listened yet, you'll find a link to the full episode in the show notes just below, or sorry, not in the show notes, podcast. What am I talking about? In the comments below, in the comment section, there's a link to the full episode of the podcast. And for the purposes of today, we're doing kind of a highlight, some of the key points that we discussed. When Brennan and I get together, we always have some really interesting conversations about various different things. I think we started by talking about things like trust and psychological safety. For the purposes of the podcast that we recorded, we veered into the area around mindset and the kinds of things that we can do to manage our mindset and what should we be doing at work. Brennan, for the purposes of people who are tuned in today, do you want to do a brief introduction to yourself and how you got into what it is that you're doing?
Certainly. Thanks so much, Aoife. And yeah, thank you so much again for inviting me to join the Happier at Work podcast. I've been a big fan of what you're doing for a long time. And as you say, every time we get to connect and chat, I always leave with a lot of, I guess, fuel. I always feel sort of fed and inspired. So yeah, I really appreciate what you're doing and the depth you're bringing to it, you know, sort of.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
The sort of research and everything you're doing. So no, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. So and my background, you know, for those that maybe we haven't connected yet, is in philosophy. So founded Philosophy at Work as this collective of people, maybe with academic backgrounds in philosophy or business psychology, but which really care about taking the tools, the ways of thinking that we learn in those disciplines and sort of teasing them out, maybe sometimes ripping them out of academic context to make them do real work for people in business. So we talk about helping businesses think their best, and we do work on things like trust, curiosity, critical thinking, self-awareness, mindset, all of those good things.
But I mean, you just, the way you've explained it, so important that there's a lot of this work being done in the academic sphere. Like when I did my master's, I finished it over 2 years ago now. But as I was reading through some of the stuff and the things that were being practiced in organizations that I worked in were 20 years old, I realized, and some of the newer thinking hadn't reached the organizational level yet. So it's really great to be able to translate, because I think often stuff that's done in an academic field is very inaccessible to people who are doing the day-to-day of managing people or being at work or being a leader or trying to build those things, like a shift in mindset, like a building trust, building curiosity as a mindset. So it's really great. And I love how you've explained that you're kind of taking those and making it a reality for people at work to be able to implement those. And I think that's, I mean, it's just really important to be able to do that. And if we kind of think about where we started our original conversations, talking about things like trust and how to build trust at work, any kind of insights to share around those, and or maybe it's another thing that you said is it's this shift in how we're thinking, or sometimes ripping out how we're currently thinking. And maybe let's talk about, how do you identify if I'm like, how do I phrase this that doesn't sound really bad? But like, if you have a thinking that's not serving you well, whether that's at an organizational level, whether it's at an individual level, how do you identify that to begin with?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So it's one thing if we can say, gosh, we've got blinders on, or we're, you know, a lot of times we'll start by working with groups around trust, because we know that we don't think our best unless we feel safe, right? But there, to your point, that conversation begins with a piece of awareness that might go, gosh, we're working in silos. We don't have a lot of psychological safety, wherever it might be. And then we can start to address some of that things and make the kind of culture where people feel safe enough to ask their questions, think for themselves, you know, share their ideas. And then there's a lot of value that comes out of that. But I think your question is brilliant, because, well, what about the unknown unknowns? You know, how do we spot if we're talking about limitations in thinking? Well, we can't get out of our own heads so much.
Yeah.
So how do we notice that? And you know, I'm often guided by the pain points. You know, so one thing that's really positive, one of the many things that's really positive about the way in which teams are so much more distributed and culturally diverse, geographically diverse. I know you're sat in Tenerife at the moment, and that you know, exploring all the sort of how is your work impacted by being in these different places, and that is so positive. But part of what that brings up, I think, also are some tensions. You know, if we were all sort of um, in the same mold, we would say, oh yeah, I agree with that. You know, I great question, Aoife. I don't have anything else to add, and we wouldn't notice the limitations in our own thinking. But because we're now working with across much more diversity of thought, diversity of place, diversity of sort of background, there's more tensions coming up, and this is a really good thing. I think sometimes in the moment it can feel like, oh, but what if we disagree, or how do we deal with disagreement really constructively? But actually, in some of those disagreements, if I said to you, I don't know, like I like happens with some of my friends sometimes, I just say something and they go, oh, that's interesting, and they share their perspective, and I realize, oh gosh, what I was saying was just one small part of it, and I start to notice my own bias and my own assumptions, the limitations of my own thinking about whatever the thing was we were talking about. So again, it's that maybe pain point is too negative, but that sort of noticing of difference of perspective that then tells us, okay, hang on, maybe there's something more to this. And if I work back a little bit more, I think even just thinking out loud, I'm conscious that for someone to do what I just described does require a degree, maybe a significant degree of self-awareness, because we have to notice the tension, the disagreements and things. And so that's why also a lot of times we start with groups on self-awareness and trust, so that we just get a little bit more noticing sort of what's going on in our bodies, what's going on in our minds, so we can notice some of the limitations of our thinking, notice some of those tensions, and then go, why is this uncomfortable right now? And it's from that then we can sort of spiral up, if that makes sense, to being able to say, okay, well, gosh, well, yeah, I've always thought that. Why have I always thought that? Is that the whole story? What do other people think? And then we're in a place where maybe everything isn't smooth, but we know what we need to work with, what we need to work on.
Yeah, no, it makes absolute sense. And one of the things that springs to my mind is what you're saying about, like, it's not necessarily the pain point, but it could reach a stage where it does become that pain point, where it's having a direct impact on the business, whether they realize it in time or not. It still could be that it gets to that stage. And you know, there's another, I suppose, another thing that springs to my mind in relation to this creating of psychological safety and living in our own beliefs. And something that I heard a while ago, I can't even remember where I heard it now, but a fish doesn't know that it's in water because it's living in that water. So if you're living in these beliefs that you have, if you're living in this thinking, going back to what you said about your friend, and you said something and you realize that that's only part of a much bigger, you know, that's how you think, that's how you believe, because that's who you are. But actually, when it comes to things like we don't even realize, because we're living our own beliefs all the time, and that's just who we are. But it's only when we come up against that conflict that we realize actually there's a whole other perspective here, and other people have different perspectives based on their beliefs and based on their own experiences.
Yeah, there's a philosopher, a late philosopher now, who is in New Zealand when I was doing my PhD in Australia, and I was working on trust, and her name was Annette Beyer, and she had this great quote, which I always circle back to. And she said that a climate of trust is like an atmosphere, and only notice it when it becomes scarce or polluted. You know, so sort of breathing all day long and thinking about it, and then we're sort of really appreciate it though when we start coughing. You know, and so I think whether or not we're talking about relational dynamics and trust to create that kind of climate where we can think our best, or if we're talking about specific elements of our work, being critically reflective about our purpose, our values, different things, a lot of the work that I think we need to do these days, and it's always been true, but it is I love that metaphor of sort of noticing the water in which we're swimming. That goes right back to
Yeah,
even like the ancient Greek thinker Plato, right? Had this allegory of the cave where you're in the story. Long story short, there's these characters that are sat in a cave and they're sort of chained up, and they're looking at a cave wall and looking at some sort of shadows moving along the wall, and they think that that's reality because it's all they've ever known. And then Plato basically writes saying that there's this sort of character that he calls philosophy that comes into the cave and
yeah,
unchains people and sort of brings them out into the complexity of actual daylight. And I think a
yeah,
lot of what we need to do is to find ways of going, let's notice the philosophies that are running in the background. Let's notice the thinking that's impacting our doing. And then, not being judgmental, but going, how's that going for us? Are we happy
yeah.
with it? Do we want to, is it accurate? Is it true? Do we need to adapt some of the things that we're doing?
This is it. And it goes back to, I didn't want to say, oh, that it's doing something bad necessarily, but
Mm,
it's understanding what the impact is, and is that the kind of impact that you want to have, and it's from a
yeah.
not completely non-judgmental perspective. And I loved what you just said about that philosopher, and it's like the air around us is like the oxygen. We only notice it when it's not there. And I had a
Mm,
really interesting conversation on someone else's podcast yesterday,
mm,
where something that I don't know whether it was an insight that came to me because of the conversation or whether it's something he directly said. But basically, when our needs are met, they become deprioritized. And that's something I hadn't
mm,
really thought about before.
mm,
I talk an awful lot about need satisfaction, but when a need is satisfied, it becomes deprioritized and you almost take it for granted then. So if you're in a great culture of trust, you
mm.
then take it for granted that if you go somewhere else, that you're going to have that same level of trust. And you probably take it for granted that the level of trust is going to stay within that organization that you're in, but it doesn't necessarily. You have to keep maintaining that.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting. The same thing goes for distrust, right? And something that comes up so often is when we have teammates who join us from a past team or a past organization where I don't know. I'd be interested to know what your colleague who was speaking about this on the podcast, I'll have to listen in, would say about this. But the where they've joined, where it's not that a need has been met, but almost a history of letdown has occurred. So there's
Mm.
almost the assumption that you can't trust, right? And there's a
Oh, interesting.
cynicism or
Yeah,
a
yeah.
skepticism that is assumed. We often talk about trust and distrust being like these goggles that we're wearing.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, yeah.
If we need to, it can be helpful if we're wearing trust goggles that expose us to be open to each other, still being
Yeah,
sort of, thoughtful and critical, and not just sort of saying yes to everything. But then equally, if there's distrust goggles on, the steps that we can take to help each other sort of remove those, not again to just be uncritical and say yes to everything, but to come to a place where we can sort of engage openly while still responsibly. So to say,
yeah.
okay, I know that I'm aware that I've been burned in the past,
Mm.
but I'm conscious that that was them. This is you, or this is now, and I'm conscious of what's running in the background and how it might be influencing my ability to collaborate or be open with you or not. And so what I'm going to do is take some steps to actually approach this relationship afresh,
Yeah.
whilst not switching off my brain, not switching off my heart, sort of
Yes.
being
Yeah,
really
yeah.
engaged. But
Yeah.
I think that idea of sort of, I guess what we're talking about is like the genealogy of our assumptions is really
Yeah.
interesting. Where they come from and how we can understand them is hugely powerful, because then we can go, oh, that's why we thought that way. Oh,
Yeah.
I don't need to think that way anymore. Or, gosh, that's interesting. That's helpful. Now I think understanding is so important for empowering us to move forward, whatever that thing might be.
Absolutely. And I know we touched on this in the podcast, this the concept of the growth mindset. And to me, that's what that
Mm,
sounds like exactly, is that you're approaching something with a growth mindset. You're assuming that someone else can evolve, that they can change. And sometimes we get stuck in that place where we think, oh, that person is the same person they always were. I include myself in that. You're making assumptions based on your first impression of someone, and it kind of stays the same. But I think that, in terms of summing up, or if people want to take a practical approach, maybe it's about noticing those kind of things, noticing their own beliefs and their own behaviors. And now, certainly when I was doing my coach training like 2.5, 3 years ago at this stage, when I was always curious about this idea of our beliefs and our limiting beliefs specifically. And I was like, how do you know what your beliefs are? Because you're living your beliefs, and it takes kind of almost an outside perspective, or a real a proper introspection to understand why you do the things that you do. And maybe that's a call to action for anyone listening today, is to really understand what are your beliefs at work, or how are your behaviors impacted by what you think and your thinking. And are you thinking critically? Are you going into things with a curious and open mind?
Yes. Yeah. And I think something just that might be practically useful is, it's one thing for us to say, gosh, I think you've hit the nail on the head. You feel like awareness, noticing is so crucial. But I think sometimes personally, it feels like, what am I looking for? How do I just have to be like on alert all the time? And so I think something that I hope is helpful, that we build into the sort of critical thinking training workshops that we do, are these simple questions. And it's kind of like, after the last few decades, there's a general intelligence around the population about sort of mindfulness techniques, right? Like many of us sort of practice mindfulness or various things, and we all sort of have this general understanding that when we're doing that, it's paying attention to what's going on in our bodies, right? So the sort of classic thing of noticing your breathing, maybe feeling your sort of inhalation come in and out, that sort of thing. What I'm talking about is an equivalent of that is for your mind, for your idea, for your thinking. And so there are questions like, who says, is that really true? And what's the big idea? And what I mean is, so that when we're writing an email, when we're working on a project by ourselves or with others, when we're in a meeting, developing the habit of thinking, well, who says? If someone says this has to be done by September 22nd or whatever, well, who says? Is that just because we've always done it that way, or because that's a date we put in 6 months ago? And is that serving us in the project best? Why are we assuming that? The next question I said was, is it really so, right? Is it really true? We say, well, the most important thing, of course, our purpose is, to help people think our best, or whatever it might be. What I would say is philosophy at work's purpose. Well, is that really true? Is that sounds nice? Is it true in what we actually do? So practicing who says, is it true? And then that third one of, well, what's the big idea? And this one I think is always so helpful for us to say, because we can get so much in the nitty gritty, or to mix metaphors, like in the weeds of a project. And to get in the habit of saying, well, what's the big idea here? I've got really close to this presentation I'm making, or this decision we're trying to do. Let's just step back and go, what's this all about? And the more that we can practice that, it's like doing our daily hour of noticing what's going on in our body. We're just getting in the habit of asking those questions. Super simple. There's no right or wrong answers necessarily, but it's just getting that habit of going, well, let's do a bit of critical thinking. Because otherwise, I think critical thinking is this term kind of like strategy, or I don't know, leadership, something that feels kind of big and magical and scary. And it's like, well, we're not doing critical thinking
and elusive.
Unless we sort of know logic and these sorts of things. Actually, it is thinking about thinking. And to do that, you can do it really organically, but when we're busy, we don't do that very well. So that's why I'm saying those kinds of questions are
they're brilliant. And I don't want to we could probably have a whole other live episode just about that. But really, really interesting insights, and really practical as well, because I think that's a huge challenge for people, and something I talk about and find it difficult myself to apply, is this whole idea of reflection, making sure that you're thinking about what it is that you're doing, that you get to the end of the day and you think, look, what went well, what do I need to do better? but also at the start of the day, what is that big picture? What is it that we're trying to achieve? And I love this idea of like, who says that it's so, and is it really true? And, you know, are we actually living according to our beliefs and our values? So we could, like I say, have a whole other conversation about that. But hopefully people found the live today useful. We didn't necessarily touch on, I mean, we had a similar conversation to what we had on the podcast, but we didn't necessarily touch on the points that we had on the podcast. So if anyone wants to listen to the full episode, much like a similar conversation to what we're having today, you will find the link in the comment section below. And if you have any questions, I haven't seen any comments come through live, but if you're watching the replay and if you have any comments or thoughts to add to the discussion here, I'd absolutely love to hear them. And thank you so much, Brennan. Always a pleasure to chat with you. Thanks for your time today. Thank you for your time on the podcast itself as well.
My pleasure, Aoife. Thanks so much for for bringing me into the community of the Happy at Work podcast. And I just love the work you're doing.
Thank you.